4 is Godsmack's most creatively interesting album thus far. Sully Erna was enduring heavy writer's block during the writing sessions for these albums, so that forced Tony, Robbie, and Shannon to really step it up. I think they wrote close to 40 songs around the time 4 was being made. Really shows how these guys are growing together, these 3 musicians. Because at this point, Shannon just immediately clicked with the other 2, at least in terms of a songwriting level. Their ideas really bounce off of each other in a way that's very natural, and you could even see that on the songs they wrote together for 4. Hey, I just realized something. What is it with bands always calling their 4th record 4? I mean, Led Zeppelin did it. Stone Temple Pilots did it, Puddle of Mud did it, Black Sabbath did it, and now Godsmack did it. Do guys just like lose their creative inspiration once they get to the 4th album? Like, do you just get lazy and think, hey, yeah, I just call it 4? You know, if I was ever in a band, I'd call my album Pho, like the Vietnamese dish, and Or, like for the boat. Pho, Or. I think that'd be a nice subversion of that trope. You know, very self-aware. Anyway, despite Sully Erna's writer's block, he still ultimately ended up with the lion's share of original material on the album. I guess he really pushed himself to come up with ideas. And this is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because Sully Erna really had to push himself creatively to come up with stuff to add to 4. And it yielded a lot of Godsmack's most interesting ideas. Even as a whole, I can't say this album really has any low points. It's just kind of coasting. But it's a curse because it made Tony Rambola, Robbie Merrill, and Shannon Larkin feel very underutilized. So much to the extent that they would later take the songs Sully rejected and use them on a much better record a couple years later, or a year later, I believe. One thing that is interesting on this album that I didn't really see in the past 3 records... Fuck. My throat's dry. One thing that is interesting about this album that we didn't really see on the past 3 records is the band writes as a collective unit for at least 3 of the songs. Livin' in Sin and One Rainy... Dude, my voice is fucked up. Livin' in Sin and One Rainy Day are 2 examples where the songs were written by the entire band members. And both songs have a very improv-esque jam-like session to them, where it feels like Godsmack is just throwing ideas out and riffing on them, seeing where they grow from there. And I have to admit, that's really cool. This is the first time in Godsmack's entire discography where I feel like it's 4 guys playing in a room coming up with ideas together. It adds a very human quality to Godsmack. The 3rd song on this album that was written by the entire band is Voodoo 2, which sounds very much like Voodoo. This is the first sequel in Godsmack's career, and I gotta give them credit. I respect them for having enough self-awareness to recognize how similar this song was to Voodoo. I don't know the entire circumstances around its creation, like this was made and it accidentally sounded like Voodoo, or if they deliberately sought to make a sequel to Voodoo. But even so, I give them credit. It does add an interesting turn to the album, and it's yet another contributor to what makes 4 such a unique record in Godsmack's career. No Rest for the Wicked, The Enemy Speak, and Bleeding Me are pretty standard Godsmack songs, but even so, given how unique some of the other songs are on this album, they stand out more. They have a little bit more of a identity because some songs lack that bite that Godsmack typically has from record to record. So when they do show that, I guess comparing a song like No Rest for the Wicked to a song like Holo, it stands out a lot more. Which brings me to my next point. Holo is a great song. I would say Holo, featuring Lisa Geyer, a longtime collaborator of Sully Erna, is one of the best songs on the album because it shows how delicate Godsmack can be. This song is acoustic in a way that's distinct from Serenity or Voodoo. It has a very somber tone, and the lyrics are really good as well. Even if Sully Erna was enduring writer's block, he came up with some gold on this track. Considering lyrics have been some of the weakest aspect of Godsmack's sound for a while in my listening experience to them, I give props to it. It's solid. And to elaborate on that lyrical branch, Shinedown is also a pretty interesting song. It's basically Sully Erna discussing his beliefs in God, or his concept of God, when comparing it to his own personal life and his own theology. One Rainy Day and Mama are definitely the best examples of Godsmack using their influences, notably Aerosmith, to broaden their sound, to make their sound grow in a way that isn't derivative. And The Enemy is also an interesting song, as it sounds very similar to Amends by Another Animal. So The Enemy is a song written by Sully Erna, and Amends was written by Tony, Robbie, and Shannon. So it's pretty neat. You're basically seeing how two different guys interpret the same song and spin it in a different way. Not all too often you get a what if for two very similar songs. So you have Sully Erna's version with The Enemy and the Another Animal version. It's almost like the Rambola cut, if you will. And I like that. I like that this provides an interesting aspect to the band where you have Sully Erna and his bandmates giving their own interpretation to the same song. While Faceless is a better record from beginning to end, I would say 4 surprised me more. And it definitely got me turning my head more times while I was listening to the album. It's interesting just how unfortunate circumstances yielded Godsmack's most notable work as of now. Some of their most intriguing songs. And that's pretty much where I'm going to go into the negatives. While 4 had more going for it than Faceless, at least in terms of interesting ideas, and while it did pique my interest more here and there, being interesting in and of itself does not make a record good. And that's really what my biggest gripe is with this album. It's not as bad as Self-Titled or Awake, but it definitely coasts along, and it feels like a band going through the motions. I'm not surprised to hear Sully Erna had writer's block, and I'm not surprised to hear that he wasted a lot of the best material by Tony Rambola, Shannon Larkin, and Robbie Merrill, because 4 is an obvious example of that. It's a record that just is almost very good, but kind of just takes a few steps back. While this album is interesting on its own, it's not interesting enough within the grand scheme of music. Between the two, Faceless is still a much better record, and 4 is a song where I just gladly cherry pick the songs I do enjoy off of it and leave it as it is. Holo, One Rainy Day, Living in Sin, and No Rest for the Wicked are really solid. They're some of my favorite Godsmack songs, and I think they're very interesting. I like Mama as well. It's cool to see Godsmack borrowing less from Metallica and Alice in Chains and more from Aerosmith, as they do play to the sound pretty solidly. And I guess that's how we should end it. I don't really find any song on this album bad, which is something to celebrate considering songs like Bad Magic exist. But at the same time, I don't really find this album compelling enough to revisit for multiple listens besides the 2 I gave it. Additionally, this album isn't good enough to overtake Faceless as Godsmack's best album so far, or despite the fact that it is a much more unique record than Faceless.